When Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukrainians had a right to resist. Yet when Palestinians resist their occupier, it's the occupier, not the occupied, that supposedly has the right to defend itself. Now, this is the completely morally inconsistent position coming out from the West right now. And it gets even worse. Look at these two clips from a White House spokesperson. The first is from this week.
Being honest about the fact that there have been civilian casualties and that there likely will be more is being honest, because that's what war is. It's brutal, it's ugly, it's messy. I've said that before. The president also said that yesterday. Doesn't mean we have to like it.
That was National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, basically telling journalists to grow up. War is dirty, war is messy, good people die, but that's life. What do you want me to do about it, right? This is war, people die. Now compare that to how Kirby talked about civilian deaths in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
It's hard to look at what he's doing in Ukraine, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical, moral individual could justify that. It's difficult to look at It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that.
So the killing of Ukrainian civilians brings John Kirby to tears. Fine, right? Got no problem with that. But when Palestinians are killed by a US ally, meh, these things happen. People die. It's war. Ash, it's a brutally stark contrast, isn't it?
It is, and it's a similar contrast that we've seen with Ursula von der Leyen. When Putin targets civilian infrastructure, power, roads, railways, it's condemned as a war crime. When Israel announces that it's going to target civilian infrastructure and then does target that very civilian infrastructure, that's Israel's right to self-defense. So consistently, you've got this double standard at play where international law should be upheld to a T when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And by the way, I agree with it. International law should be upheld to a T in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it has absolutely no relevance or bearing when it comes to Israel's ongoing occupation, which is illegal under international law, or its present activities in Gaza, which are also, I believe, illegal under international law. So what explains this? What explains this total cognitive dissonance? One is that Israel has always been a sort of, strategic outsourcing of American violence in the Middle East. That is the nature of Israel's presence geopolitically when it comes to the United States. Neither Israel nor the United States, for that matter, are signatories of the International Criminal Court, and Netanyahu even disputes its jurisdiction when it comes to Palestinian matters. Why? Because Netanyahu doesn't believe that Palestine is a sovereign state. So this idea that there's going to be any kind of universality of the standards which are applied when it comes to what states do, they're already out of the window when it comes to Israel. And I think that this is something which has been part and parcel of Israel's position on these matters for decades, since the very beginnings of its inception in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. But it's also been something which has been strengthened because of its relationship to the United States. And when, of course, the United States and the UK drove a coach and horses through international law through our invasion of Iraq, that's also something which gives, great comfort to other states who want to do the same kind of thing. There is absolutely no mechanism for international law to be upheld when it comes to Israel. The second thing to talk about, of course, here is racism. Palestinians are victims of racism. They're victims of anti-Arab racism, and they're victims of Islamophobia, regardless of whether or not a particular Palestinian is Muslim. And we see that in terms of the way in which their lives are so consistently devalued. The media coverage began on the 7th of October. Maybe occasionally you'll get a mention if there's a particularly bad flare-up of settler violence in the West Bank. But generally, in the West, there is a media blackout when it comes to the daily human rights abuses which are inflicted on Palestinians by the Israeli state and by Israeli settlers. And what that tells you is that Palestinian lives have very little value when it comes to Western media, the Western political view, unless or until it's coming into conflict with Israeli lives. And I think that that is pure racism. It comes from seeing people who are Arab as less human than people who aren't Arab. And because the way in which Jewish people are imagined, now, of course, not all Jewish people are white, and of course, Jewish people who one would describe as racially white have not been understood as racially white in other periods of history. But because generally, Israel is sort of seen as a outpost of America or an outpost of Europe. It's imagined as being part of a community of nations which are white dominated. It means that their lives get to matter. They get to suffer. We get to see them as whole human beings in a way that Palestinians just don't get the opportunity. And I think the other thing, as well as Palestinians being victims of racism in their own right, they're victims of the historic racism that Jewish people have faced for centuries. Because I don't think we'd be having any of this conversation in terms of Israel geopolitically or how we think about Israeli lives and how they're presented versus Palestinian lives, were it not for a legitimate collective guilt that European powers and many Americans feel over what happened during the Holocaust. The fact that so many Jewish people were turned away. They were turned away when they were seeking refuge in other European countries, turned away when they're seeking refuge in America, and that the full horror of what was being done was not fully accepted until it was too late and the camps were being liberated. I think there's an immense amount of collective guilt over that and an attempt to externalize that, to externalize the complicity of Western powers with anti-Semitism by putting it all on the Palestinians. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is this idea about the monopoly of suffering, the legitimacy that is drawn from the monopoly of suffering. And so that's why you have to consistently talk down Palestinian suffering, because it delegitimizes Israel and its disposition in relation to the Palestinians, but it also undermines, I think, the particular way in which Western powers have dealt with their collective guilt over anti-Semitism.
Back to the Russia-Ukraine comparison, I've seen some sort of journalists, again, not unreasonably, sort of in the last few days or last couple of weeks, sort of say, oh, now all the focus is on Israel-Palestine. We need to make sure people remember that Ukraine is still being occupied. It might look like the action is going on in Israel-Palestine, but Ukraine is still being occupied. Well, Israel has been occupying Palestine for 56 years, if you're sort of a liberal who believes in a two-state solution, or for 75 years, if you think the whole thing was a settler colonial project. So you've got sort of two different dates depending on your position. But everyone agrees, the UN agrees, that Palestine has been under occupation for 56 years. 56 years, right? So if these journalists are worried, oh, people are turning their attention away from Ukraine, which has now been occupied for 2 years, 56 years. And why do you think we see such extreme action? That's the other thing you hear. So, well, Ukrainians haven't done the same kind of attacking civilians. They haven't, right? But if they had been occupied for 56 years, I don't want to second guess what they might do, right? It's a different situation, especially as the Ukrainians are being backed by the West. They've got, the most highly technical weapon systems in the world. As I say, I want them to beat Russia off their territory. It's an illegal invasion. It's a war of aggression from Russia. But the Ukrainians are able to fight back in this way that we see as very legitimate because they have the support of the West. The Palestinians have been under occupations for 56 years. They are, they don't have any weapons sent from the West. They can't even get water in their territory, right? And then when they resist in a way as they have done, and I mean, obviously the targeting of civilians, of grandparents, of young children, always wrong, I think. But this judgment of the entire movement, it's very different from Ukraine because Ukraine is fighting military targets, whereas the Palestinians, some of them targeted civilians. I just think is just so historical. It's just offensive. Of course, this show and all our journalism at Novara Media is only possible thanks to the support of people like you. Our funding model doesn't rely on advertising partners or venture capital. It relies on the monthly donations from our viewers. So if you can, please consider joining our regular supporters via our website. That's novaramedia.com/support. From just £1 a month, you can help us hit our target to get 5,000 new supporters and get ready for 2024. That link again is in the description box below.